I'm delighted to be joined today by one of my favourite lecturers in evolutionary biology that I was very lucky to have during my time studying it at Cambridge, Dr Matt Wilkinson, who is a lecturer in the zoology department at Cambridge University and author of the book Restless Creatures, all about evolution and locomotion and how they interrelate. And it's a real pleasure to be with you today, Dr Wilkinson. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here and to see you again after so many years.
Yes, thank you. I really, really enjoyed your lectures, and it was always very enthusiastic and enlightening. Tell us a little bit about your career and your background, how you got to become a lecturer in evolutionary biology.
Sure. So I started out as an undergraduate at Cambridge University, ended up doing a PhD here as well in pterodactyl flight, which was kind of where my love of evolution and locomotion was born. After that, I moved to Clare College, where I did a junior research fellowship. Had a little bit of a break after that, and then got a book deal. So I was approached by a literary agent who was very interested in what I might have to say about the evolution of locomotion. So that then happened, and one thing led to another. I ended up getting back into Cambridge with a teaching position in the zoology department, which is where I find myself now.
So did a young Matt Wilkinson just play with lots of models of pterodactyls and go, this is what I want my future to be?
I'm sure there was a bit of that. There's actually a picture that my dad dug up a while back, which I drew when I was 4 years old, of various dinosaurs and pterosaurs. So clearly it was on my mind then. But I think you could say that about most small boys. I mean, honestly, no, I wouldn't have dreamed that I'd end up coming down this path. I've just been very lucky, I think, and had a lot of useful correct moves and the opportunities presented to me. I've been very fortunate to have, and but no, I didn't know that. And I think I was always really interested in living things. I remember I'd spend a lot of time in the garden, just sort of poking into bushes and things and seeing what was there, and loving all the old David Attenborough series. Clearly, it's not a surprise that I've ended up where I am now, even if I hadn't kind of mapped it all out. Yes.
Were you sort of a regular at the Natural History Museum and things like that? What really spurred on that interest in the beginning?
Yeah, or when I could. I mean, we didn't live particularly near London, but I loved the Natural History Museum, always have done. So yeah, that was always wonderful. But it was getting out and sort of seeing these things on your doorstep. I think that was really what sort of started me off. I have a very clear memory of watching David Bellamy's Backyard Safari. I mean, this is really going back a bit now. This is an early 80s series, I think. Because it was exactly that. He was miniaturized and was kind of going on all sorts of adventures in the garden and then encountering all these extraordinary organisms which are just there on the doorstep. And I think that's always been a kind of big thing of mine, is that's how rich the living world is in your local environment. You don't have to go to Africa or Borneo to kind of see all these extraordinary things. And it's something I've always tried to kind of inject into my teaching.
So could you tell us, outside of teaching, what do evolutionary biologists do? I sometimes find with the creationists and the intelligent design people, they think that you just sit in an office dreaming about Darwin, reading dusty old books and making thought experiments. So what does, outside of your teaching at the university, what does life as an evolutionary biologist look like?
Well, I mean, it can take a number of different forms. It's really quite a diverse field. I mean, evolution is at the heart of biology. So, in a sense, it sort of underpins what all biologists do in a way. There are some who are delving into the very kind of direct genetic aspect of it. There are a lot of people in my department who do that. So looking at, for instance, the genome of butterflies and see what you can kind of tease apart from that, see how that's changing from species to species, what traits that might affect. Then you have the paleontologists, and I would count myself among those. Maybe perhaps in a somewhat foreign distance, but who are looking at evidence of past life, so examining fossils. And then there are various things you can do with that. You can try and use that information to piece together the family tree of life. You can try and work out how these organisms lived. Again, that's something I very much did during my PhD, which is about pterodactyl flight, where I was looking at pterosaur fossils, seeing how their joints articulated, what their wingspan was, what their wing area was. And then you can do various modeling things. I mean, in my case, I actually built models which I then put into a wind tunnel to try and work out how these things may have flown. But their modeling can take a number of different forms. If you're interested in the evolution of behavior, for instance, there's all sorts of interesting models, for instance, game theory, which you can use to try and work out why animals behave in the way they do. You can see how ecology impacts on evolution. You can do experimental evolution. So there are lots of really nice examples now of populations of living species where we're actually tracking their evolution over time. It sort of started out with bacteria, but now there are some very long-term experiments. There's the Galapagos finches, very famously. Probably, I was going to say a 40-year study. I think it's more than that now. So a 40-plus year study, just looking at how these birds are evolving. We have this wonderful sort of protracted study of various aspects of lizard evolution in the Caribbean. There's guppies in Trinidad. So it's getting increasingly common now for people to actually do experimental evolution. Because what we're often finding is that things do change often quicker than you might expect, which is great from a kind of scientific point of view. It means that this is not, as many might think, something completely inaccessible to us because it happens over, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. This is something that you can absolutely observe within a human lifetime.
Yeah. How much does genetics play into your regular routine research, even though you're a paleontologist yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I would say not an awful lot day to day. It's something, obviously, I'm very interested in because it is, it is the way that genes change over time does underpinning what happens to organismal form, even though it's the organismal form that I tend to be more interested in. I think that the aspects of genetics that I tend to get more drawn to these days is developmental genetics. So looking at how you can take a genome and treating that as a kind of set of rules, a sort of a recipe, whatever, and build an organism. And particularly thinking about how that changes over time and the sort of options that you might get, bearing in mind how the development of an organism works genetically. So just to kind of come up with an example, which I talk a bit about in my book, it's very important for anything that's that moves around, so a locomotory creature. If it's moving consistently in one direction, then the front end is going to have to be different from the back end. So we find this built into the developmental genetic blueprint with various chemicals, various genes that are switched on, which will tell you which end of the organism is which. It sort of becomes a bit like a kind of developmental GPS system, which is very interesting, and interesting to see how strongly conserved a lot of this stuff is. So it's a horrible name, but there's a protein called 𝐖th, which is secreted at the back end of almost all animals, and that's kind of what then sets our main axis. Yeah, so it's interesting to kind of tease apart these rules, and then very interesting to kind of see how that system itself might have evolved. So this is kind of going back before we had the kind of the body plan that we have now, and trying to work out how we might take an older body plan. It's probably somewhat inappropriate to say this, but the sort of thing that you might see in a sea anemone, for instance. I'm not saying we evolved from sea anemones, but that sort of symmetry system, how you could turn that into the sort of symmetry system that we have. Just tremendously interesting.
Yeah, it was more popularly called Evo Devo in in my time as a student.
Yes, I should have used that term. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a great book on it by Sean Carroll, I think, sort of explaining it at a popular level. when it comes
Yeah,
to
endless
studying,
forms, most beautiful.
yes, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Um, I always got from you a great enthusiasm for studying ancient life. And
Mhm.
there's sort of this infectious, passionate interest in it. So, could you get into the details of how someone can study ancient life? Because we think about fossils, and sequencing the Neanderthal genome was an incredible feat, which very well deserving of the Nobel Prize a few years ago. But you can't really get intact DNA from a pterodactyl skeleton. Um, so
Oh,
apologies and
only.
spoilers for all those into Jurassic Park. But so how do you go about studying ancient life? You mentioned model building, but just break it down for us.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, there are a number of ways you can do that. I mean, obviously, it has to, well, it will generally start with the fossil evidence. There are other points of access to ancient life. You can reconstruct ancient life forms. So, when we have a family tree, an evolutionary tree, that one can take sort of living things that are at the branches of that tree, and then trace them back to their last common ancestor. And bearing in mind what we know about their descendants, you can reconstruct quite a lot of what we imagine that organism would have been like. Which can give us enormous insight. And particularly if you then have some kind of way of time calibrating your tree, often thanks to fossil evidence, but also radioisotopes and the like, then we can see what organisms lived at a particular time and maybe say certain things about why this particular form may have been suited to that particular time in that particular place. So, and that doesn't necessarily involve actual reconstruction of a fossil at all. So you can go quite far just using living things, and particularly if you're thinking about um, yeah, Neanderthals, etc. aside, if you want to reconstruct the genetic story, then you have to do this, and you have to use living things and kind of reconstruct their ancestors on that basis. If you do have fossils, then yeah, you can do all sorts of things with them uh, depending on the quality of preservation, which can sometimes be really spectacular. I mean, knowing that we're going to be speaking to Simon Colin Morris, I won't talk much about the Burgess Shale because that's very much his turf, and he'll be able to tell you everything you would ever want to know about that. But certainly, we're getting organisms preserved in astonishing detail there. But then you can kind of go beyond that. So my work on locomotion with the pterosaurs, as I said, I built wind tunnel models based on the fossil evidence, which I was then able to directly test and measure things like how much lift they're producing at certain speeds and all that. Of course, you can also reconstruct things in a computer. Again, thinking of the sort of the more biomechanical side of things, you can often detect where various muscles would have attached. So you can then kind of reconstruct the musculoskeletal system of your organism of interest in the computer, and then see how that might have moved. So yeah, there are lots and lots of avenues that you can use to explore ancient life. Some of which will use the fossil evidence, some of which won't.
Now, obviously on Earth, we've got some animals that are truly ancient that are still with us and can tell us a lot about the story of life on Earth. My most vivid memory from Cambridge was having to write a paper on the evolution of the nervous system of jellyfish, which was excruciatingly difficult. But, I remember saying to my wife, I've got a list of 7 organisms to choose from. And when I tell you that my second best option is sponges, that should tell you everything you need to know about the list. But I found that difficult, but I also found it amazing. So, what can the study of organisms that are still thriving on Earth now tell us about the ancient history of the Earth and of life itself?
Yeah, great question, and yeah, sorry for asking asking you to do that. It was a very good answer, as I remember. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that make me feel so lucky that we have so many lineages that descend from such an ancient branching point. It's just wonderful that these guys are still here, and that we're able to kind of tell so much about what happened in the very depths of the tree of life, and particularly the tree of life of the animal kingdom. I mean, you mentioned sponges there. Um, Again, often overlooked and regarded as very simple, but there's all sorts of things we're discovering about them now. Um, and I am going to forget the name. Nickel, is it Michael? That's really bad of me. I've forgotten the name of the. There's Daniel Lees, I think. Daniel Lees. I might be getting all of these names completely mangled. But yeah, there's all sorts of research groups which are looking into the behavior of these sponges, and that might come as a surprise to think that sponge is behaving at all. But what particularly drew my attention was this discovery that a lot of sponges can contract themselves, despite not having any nerves, despite not having any muscle. And it's fairly simple. It's very slow, which is why you often miss it. So it's, we're talking one contraction every 45 minutes or something. So you need to use time-lapse photography to kind of really observe this. But it's a coordinated whole body contraction, which is very surprising to see in a creature that doesn't have a nervous system. But what the researchers have found is that there are motor proteins that are scattered throughout the body, if I can call it that, the body of the sponge. We've detected sensory cells which seem to be releasing some kind of chemical which initiates the contractions, which is very similar to what happens at a synapse. So the way that a nerve might communicate with another nerve, how a nerve might communicate with a muscle by the release of a chemical which initiates a contraction. So what we seem to be possibly getting there is a sort of snapshot of a precursor of our nerves and muscles, which is tremendously exciting. And of course, that then raises all sorts of other questions about, well, why they do this, how that then might have led to the much more complex system that we see in us, and that's where things like jellyfish come in, because they are sort of illustrating possibly the next step on that road.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what these old organisms can do without a brain, as such. It's just more a different sort of solution to the problem of a nervous system. My favorite actually was the slime mold. Slime mold having memory and being able to solve puzzles and mazes and all sorts without having anything like what we have. There's sort of a snapshot of how life solved the problem. Let's get on to Restless Creatures, the book that you've written. Where did your interest
Mhm.
in evolution and locomotion come from, and how did you come to sort of tying these two together?
Mm. Yeah, so it really began when I was still an undergraduate here at Cambridge. Um, and it was due to the kind of combination of courses I was doing. I mean, I'd always been interested in evolution, particularly evolutionary history, particularly vertebrates' evolutionary history, sort of how that all played out, because we have such a rich fossil record for them. And it's such a fantastic story. And I really started to kind of get into biomechanics. I had some really fantastic teachers. There's Professor Charlie Ellington, who ended up being my PhD supervisor. No, sadly, he passed away a few years ago. Yeah, who again, he had that enthusiasm. And that it was presenting us with that way of looking at the world. Not just some kind of um, sort of taking an animal for granted. Oh, this is just what it happens to be like. It's just going to, okay, well, we can work out why it's got to be like this because of this and this and this, because it's obeying these physical rules. And when I came to think about what I wanted to do a PhD in, or what started to get me thinking about doing research, I'd been captivated by pterosaurs for a long time. They had been worked on an awful lot back then. We're talking sort of the mid 90s, I guess, when I was starting to think about this. Um, and it struck me that, flight is a very difficult thing to do. It's a very demanding activity. It requires a lot of rules to be followed. You need the body has to be a certain way to make that work. And that struck me as a really useful tool, because when you have fairly limited fossil evidence, you can combine that evidence with an understanding of how aerodynamics works. Then that kind of gives you that extra layer of understanding. You can kind of see okay, it's kind of constraining your inquiry. You know that it's got to kind of fit within a certain possibility space, if I can put it in that rather abstract way. Um, yeah, and it's so it felt like a kind of really rich kind of combination of fields to kind of be able to kind of shine that brighter light on the ancient past. But what then happened was after kind of doing that with pterosaurs, it just sort of opened my eyes to a more kind of general application of that rule. That if you just look at the living world, particularly looking at the way that things move, no, movement is difficult. It's generally difficult. Moving well, moving efficiently, moving effectively is a really difficult thing to do. So again, by understanding those rules of locomotion, it gives you a tremendously powerful way of understanding why the living world is the way it is. So that's really what then sort of sowed the seed for the book. So when I was, in conversation with literary agents and publishers, that was kind of the selling point. That I remember very vividly a conversation I had with my agent when I was struggling with the outline, and it was all too academic, and we couldn't kind of find the sort of the way through to kind of make this story make sense. And he asked me to kind of sum up the book in a sentence. Terrible thing to be put on the spot like that. And I recalled there's a very famous quote by a Ukrainian scientist, actually, as Theodosis Dobzhansky, that nothing in biology makes sense unless in the light of evolution. Very famous. And yes, the kind of the hook for my book was that actually not much in evolution makes sense unless in the light of locomotion, which is a very controversial thing to say, but yeah. Then my agent said, "Yeah, write that down." And
Yeah.
that's the story of your book.
Well,
So then it
it
kind of came from
seems.
there. And it was
Yeah.
then yeah. Sorry. Um,
No, I was just going to say, it seems so obvious when you think about it. Of course, movement would be a massive driver of evolution, and yet it's not something that you hear about all that much outside of your book. Um, if I poke at an example for a moment, if I go back to the jellyfish, just because I remember that's seared into my mind so much.
see it.
You identify two sorts really. There were the rowers and the jetters, those that jellyfish that sort of row their way through the sea,
Yep.
and those that shoot jets of water to sort of propel them along. And that's really the two different types of jellyfish we have today. Why aren't all jellyfish
Yeah.
rowers or all jellyfish jetters? Why do we get two different types?
Yeah. God, very good question. Yeah, so it's partly a size thing. So, although that doesn't really answer the question, but there's an association with size. Yeah, so the jet-propelled ones, they tend to be much more bullet-shaped, so they're quite long, relatively thin, and also quite small. Because trying to do that when you're very large is really tough, particularly for jellyfish, because jellyfish are very weak animals,
Yeah.
partly because of where the way their muscles work. So unlike us, where we have a kind of separate muscle tissue, in jellyfish, the muscle is built into their surface layers. So it's very, very thin. So it doesn't produce much force. So yeah, they're pretty weak. So for the larger ones, they had to go for a much more kind of sedate, much more energetically less demanding way of moving around. So and that's completely dominated their shape as well. It means that they're relatively broad and flat rather than kind of long and thin. But as I say, that doesn't really completely answer the question. I think it boils more down to the kind of ecological options that you have as a kind of floating jellyfish-like thing. So what you see is that the small jet-propelled ones, they're essentially ambush predators. So they will just sort of hang there, waiting for things to kind of intercept. They don't really use their locomotory skills for that so much. It's more a kind of escape response. The exception would be the box jellyfish, which are extremely maneuverable. They have quite complex image-forming eyes, bizarrely, and you can run them through obstacle courses and things. They're really they've got a lot going on. But then the other ones, they tend to be more kind of just cruisers. So they're constantly moving, constantly rowing, and then anything that gets caught up in those rowing currents, they then kind of have the opportunity to catch. It's a very different way of existing as that sort of organism.
Mm.
So yeah, that I would say I'm sure you could go deeper, but that's what you're getting from me. That's what you're getting from me today.
Yeah, you'll have to
Yes, it's
buy the
that
book.
kind of diversion ecology. Yeah.
Yeah, the
You
audience will
will.
have to pick
Yeah.
up the book to find out more. But you did touch on the fact that locomotion obviously plays a huge role in directing evolution in two fronts. Firstly, what you can eat and how you can hunt, but also defying constraints on
Yes.
size. Um, and so some creatures, because of the way they adapt to their movement, allows them to grow bigger than they could be otherwise. An interesting one for me in my evolutionary biology studies was whales. Obviously, you've got the whales that have teeth and the whales that have
Mm.
baleen. And with the exception of very few individuals, like sperm whales are very big but have teeth, and minke whales are small but have baleen, the biggest ones are the ones that have baleen, and they're slender. They're called rorquals, and they've adapted, but they travel a lot further. So could you speak into a little bit of how
Mhm.
locomotion can transform body plans, feeding, and other aspects of ecology?
Yeah, cool. That's a tough one. I mean, the thing that made it was when you started talking about whales. Um, I mean, there you have. Yeah, the interesting thing about I mean, yeah, it's a very good observation that it's the largest ones tend to have baleen. I mean, the sperm whales, the fact that they don't do it is really interesting. Still, certainly to me at least, a bit of a mystery. But because what you have with these gigantic whales is to sustain a population of such enormous organisms. Um, it's quite ecologically challenging. You need a very productive ecosystem that can do that. And one of the things that helps by doing that is to feed relatively, it's for the larger organisms to feed quite low down in the food chain. Because every time you move up a level, you're losing a lot of energy as heat. So yeah, it's easier to sustain a population of very big things if you're feeding quite low down. But then, of course, you have this really curious situation of an extremely large animal feeding on very small things, hence the need to filter feed. Um, and they had to use their locomotion to make that work. So they had to power through the water to kind of scoop. I'm sure everyone's seen the David Attenborough programs where this features sort of open their mouth and just scoop this enormous amount of water plus krill, etc., which they then kind of squeeze out. And that again is a very energetically demanding thing to do. Um, and I think what we're seeing with these large whales is about as far as you can push that way of life. This is another kind of interesting scaling thing, is that as you get bigger, you tend to get weaker. Not in absolute terms, but the amount of force you can produce relative to your weight or relative to your mass starts getting smaller and smaller. Yeah, so eventually, you're going to reach a point where that sort of filter feeding thing isn't going to work anymore. But anyway, so we're talking about, certainly in more general terms, about, is it how locomotion? Forgive me, I've gone off on a tangent. What was the question?
The effect of locomotion on body plans and on ecology and the kind of ways you can feed and travel.
Gotcha. Yeah. So the body plan one, that's a good one. I kind of alluded to that earlier when I was thinking about our symmetrical body plan. The fact that we have a front end, which has, that's where you get your long range sense organs. So that's where the eyes are going to be. That's where the sense of smell tends to be. Often where the mouth is, although not always, because that's that's the bit of the organism that's going to encounter the environment first. And then the back end is often where you're going to find the anus, because otherwise you'll be swimming through your own waste or walking through your own waste. It's helped to discharge that into your wake. Again, there are exceptions, and also to make sure that again, usually you want the kind of the motors, the engines, to be symmetrically deployed about your midline. And so what I've essentially just described there is the bilateral symmetry system, which you find in over 99% of animals. Also, what you tend to find in these is the top, so the dorsal side, the back, tends to be different from the front. This is going to get confusing because we are now standing upright. So if you imagine I was lying on my belly, that's the kind of the ancestral configuration. So the lower side, again, that's probably where you want that's where the propulsion is going to come from. If you're crawling, the top side is where you're going to want to put things like camouflage or spines or whatever. So all of this, there's a kind of real body plan consistency that needs to be used to kind of make sure that all of this works very well, and that's reflected in the developmental genetics of our body plan, which are strikingly conserved. And then when we got things like, if we then move into broadly how locomotion impacts ecology, how it impacts feeding. I mean, more often than not, if you're thinking of feeding, you have to be able to find what you're eating and quite often outrun it, or defeat its defenses in some other way. So locomotion will often feed into that, both in terms of the navigational strategies that animals might use, and also the simple effectiveness of their locomotion. Immediately, what's springing to mind is the African savannah, excuse me, where we've had this protracted arms race, where it's very much a battle in the locomotory world, where speed and maneuverability are a life or death game there. So it plays into a whole range of very important kind of life processes, and reproduction, of course. That the more you're able to eat, the more you'll be able to reproduce. The more efficiently you can move, the less you'll be burning that fuel, and the more energy you'll then have to devote to the important business of making babies. It may play into mate selection itself. So, all these kind of really important boxes that need to be ticked if you're going to have any lifetime reproductive success, quite often involve locomotion, which combined with how tricky it is and how difficult it is to build a body that does this effectively, that again really does help to explain why it's so important for the playing out of evolutionary history.
It's so fascinating to think about, and I have to ask you another question about humans and where we come into this. One of my favourite statistics I remembered was when a human races a horse, in a sprint, it's going to lose every time. But over marathon distances, humans can beat horses. So why have we evolved, given the sort of the dangers our ancestors would have faced in Africa? Why have we evolved to become marathon runners instead of sprinters for the most part?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a fantastic story, and it's one of the great twists of evolutionary history about the thinking about where we came from, going back to when we were run-of-the-mill apes, if one can call them that. Fruit eaters, probably living in the trees, and for whatever reason, possibly due to the drying out of the climate, something like between sort of 10 and 5 million years ago, a lineage of apes ended up coming down out of the trees and moving around on the in what increasingly became a more sort of open savanna type habitat. And you'd think we wouldn't stand a chance, because that then pits us against antelope and puts us in competition with things like lions and cheetahs. These are sort of paragons of locomotory excellence, and then here we are, sort of Johnny's come lately, just wandering onto the savannah, trying to make a living in this world. And yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of disagreement about exactly how this happened and why this may have kind of played out as it did. But one of the most important aspects of sort of being a human rather than being an ape is our sort of upright bipedalism. And I probably should qualify that, because I think there's increasing evidence that sort of uprightness actually evolved in the trees, that may have been associated more with just being a large animal in that environment. So that if you're
Right.
If you're able to kind of hold yourself upright, then you can use your arms to help sort of steady yourself while your legs are taking your weight. And if you think about how things like chimpanzees or gorillas or gibbons particularly move around up there, that tends to be what happens. But anyway, that's a somewhat side issue. But anyway, so we are bipedal, just come down out of the trees, which gives us a number of potential advantages. quite often going to be thermal advantages rather than kind of strictly locomotory, although our bipedal locomotion does tend to be a bit more efficient than quadrupedal locomotion in chimpanzees, for instance. But it meant that we could cool down more easily or keep cool more easily. So we're exposing less of our body area to the sun. It may well be in this context that we lost a lot of our body hair and became sweaty, or at least using sweat to keep us cool, because that's really quite rare among mammals. Horses, interestingly, are an exception there, so they can also use sweat to cool down. That means that we can do things like sort of run for hours and hours and hours, sort of chasing these organisms down until they will drop from heat stroke. And we have the coolant system, which means that we don't do that ourselves. But of course, there's all sorts of other stuff going on to kind of to hone our endurance running capabilities that you see mapped out quite nicely, actually, if you look at sort of the evolution of the hominin lineage, which is the lineage between the divergence of humans and chimpanzees on one hand, and the appearance of our own species, and we are hominins. Is longer legs, of course. We have somewhat shorter toes, that mean that we can kind of give a really strong push off to the ground without risk of our toes breaking. We have bigger buttocks because those are the main hip extensors. We have very well developed image stabilization, so nice flexible necks, so that we can do all this stuff with our body while the eye line remains quite stable. Yeah, there's all sorts of things happening with the arms as well to kind of make sure that the twisting sort of motions that might be applied by the legs are balanced by the arms. Yeah, so it's all of this is kind of fantastic for the endurance running. And I guess we were just never really built as sprinters to begin with. That was never really an option for us, because if you look at sprinters, they tend to stand on tiptoe, so permanently on tiptoe, like, well, thinking of a horse. A horse is standing on one toe and then have this enormously elongated foot. So all the kind of the musculature of the leg, then it gets concentrated towards the body, and then it's all kind of remote control tendons as you kind of move out along that limb. Just because increasing your stride length is a fantastic way of increasing your speed. Being quadrupedal is also a fantastic way of potentially increasing your stride length, because that then opens the door to galloping, where you can then use the flexibility of your back to increase your stride length even further. And this, of course, is what cheetahs do, to an extraordinary degree. They can, their stride length is about 8 meters, I think. It can be pushed to. We do have a galloping gait, by the way, so humans can gallop. That's our skipping gait. But it does do us a lot of good because we're bipedal. It's very good on the moon, because you end up with very vertical force vectors being applied to the ground, which is very useful when your mass is the same but your weight is much less. It means you're less likely to slip. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant! Really fascinating. And
I've since forgotten the question, by the way, but I hope
no, that was perfect. And
I've managed to answer something.
yes, no, it was so interesting, and I really recommend everyone pick up Restless Creatures as a very accessible book on this topic, and it opens up a whole world of studying evolution to a lot of people that I think they'll enjoy in the way that they enjoy David Attenborough. I know with evolution, you're often studying the present and you're looking at the past, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts or what you think are the most interesting questions when looking at the potential future of evolution.
Yeah, that is a really difficult one. Yeah, it's just because it's just difficult to predict the direction that evolution is going to go in. I mean, imagine if we were in the Mesozoic, world dominated by dinosaurs. I think no one would have laid any kind of bets on the world we live in now, being what would happen, and particularly the emergence of humans. I mean, that really has. I mean, what an astonishing thing to happen. Is the appearance of Homo sapiens, utterly unique. Lots of utterly unique species, of course, and I don't mean to kind of elevate us above everything else, but it's nothing like us has ever has come along before. Nevertheless, I mean, I think there are certain patterns that we can see. And again, Simon Conway Morris is your man for this because he's very interested in compiling cases of convergent evolution, which is where you end up with rather different or creatures that have come from very different starting points that end up resembling each other. Partly due to similar needs. They may be living in a similar environment, be doing a similar thing, but also because of the way that they've been constrained by what's come before, or by the rules of physics, or whatever. And so those constraints, of course, are always, well, I shouldn't say always, but one must always bear those constraints in mind when thinking of what life can do. So, if we have a catastrophic mass extinction, there are certain things that you would expect to kind of crop up again. We would expect, to see large-bodied carnivores running around, and would therefore have broadly similar adaptations to what you see in large carnivores now. And obviously, we are different from the I should say, the non-bird dinosaurs, in that mammals tend to be four-legged, whereas they tend to be two-legged. But a lot of the rules are somewhat similar. I mean, that itself is a kind of interesting question about why the four legs rather than two. But not one I'm going to get into now, unless you want me to. So flying things are likely to kind of keep cropping up because we know that has kind of happened again and again and again. So it's a kind of, it's that nice sort of sweet spot. So it's probably not going to be something kind of completely chaotic free for all. I think as we move into the distant future, certain forms of life are going to be familiar to us, but we don't know exactly what form they're going to take. Difficult even to predict who's going to inherit the Earth either. I mean, obviously the non-bird dinosaurs had their day in the sun. Mammals are kind of somewhat taking over, although of course dinosaurs are still very much alive and well in the form of birds and are doing perfectly well. So difficult to see who's going to be the beneficiary. Partly because during a mass extinction, it is often a bit of a lottery, not entirely, but a bit of a lottery as to who survives and who doesn't, and that will completely dominate what form the living world will take from there on.
Do you have
it
any?
turned out that the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, a few mammals got through, so we end up kind of dominating from that point on.
Do you have any thoughts on directed evolution and what we can do now with genetic engineering and things like that, manipulating particularly microorganisms to our own ends?
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is still in its early stages. I mean, I don't know much about it, I would say. It's not something I've ever really studied. It obviously feels, one sort of ethical heckles scale, sort of the warning bells start to ring about what we might end up doing if we start sort of tinkering this way. But we're already doing that, of course. I mean, I wasn't going to get hot water here, but artificial selection has been a thing for much of human history. This has kind of given us the crops we have. We now have a lot more tools that we can use to, for instance, make some crops more drought resistant, more salt tolerant. And I have absolutely no problem with that. I think this, we are, global food security is a pressing concern, and we need to feed the world. So I've absolutely got no problem with kind of that sort of tinkering. But yeah, who knows where that sort of technology might end up taking us. But of course, always we have to kind of come back to the kind of ecological imperatives that, to cut it in this world, you have to be very effective as an organism. And it's difficult to, if you're really tinkering, if you're kind of generating radical different forms, more often than not, those sorts of organisms aren't going to work very well at all. I mean, this is why evolution tends to proceed by baby steps, sort of gradual step by gradual step, because that's the only way, the sort of safe way to kind of navigate this world. There's nothing inherently stopping a more radical mutation happening, but they're almost always going to be selected against because, you've got to be careful as a living thing. It's a tough old world.
Yeah. Can you tell us what you're working on at the moment, or anything in particular you're researching that's interesting?
Yeah, well, I've got another book in mind. I've talked a little bit about constraint. And yeah, so there's a book I'd like to write about what evolution hasn't done and why. So yeah, watch this space. It's probably not going to come that quickly, but yes. So
Excellent.
mythological creatures will be involved in trying to explain why they haven't happened yet.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that. And where can people find out more about yourself and your teaching and your research?
Sure. So, well, you can find me at the University of Cambridge. So I'm so www.cam.ac.uk, or rather, I should say www.zoo.cam.ac.uk, which will take you straight to the zoology department. I'm also a fellow of Jesus College, so that's jesus.cam.ac.uk, I believe. I'm on Instagram for what it's worth, so you can find me that way. I think my handle there is pterodactyl Matt. I really should be more prepared. That was certainly my Twitter handle, but I'm not particularly active on, well, what used to be Twitter, but I'm not particularly active there anymore. But yeah, so you can find me on Instagram.
Excellent. And people can get Restless Creatures on Amazon and anywhere good books are sold, right?
Yes.
Brilliant.
It's been a while now. It's come
Yeah.
up to its 9-year anniversary, so
Yeah, I
it's
was
not
gonna
in many bookshops, but you can certainly still find it.
I was going to say it must be nearly a decade now, surely. But yeah, still as interesting
Yeah,
as ever.
seems to be.
Ancient life
Yeah,
never gets old. Uh, Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us
that's a
today.
good one.
It's been a pleasure talking
Oh,
with
thank
you
you,
again.
Sam. Likewise.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more amazing conversations with incredible researchers who are changing the world we live in and driving humanity forward. Feel free to check out my Instagram at polymath_Sam or go to my website at www.sam-mckee.co.uk.